Guys, so today we're going to be spending some time taking a quick look at Lyndon Johnson. So he is the vice president that follows John F. Kennedy after his assassination. So a couple things to be aware of with Johnson. So this picture here, first of all, is Johnson swearing in. So basically, as soon as they heard of Kennedy's assassination, Johnson got on a plane to fly directly to Washington, D.C., first going by Texas in order to pick up Mrs. Kennedy. So you can see that Jackie is down here at the bottom in the right-hand side of this picture. She's actually still wearing the suit that she was wearing when her husband was killed. And he was sworn in on Air Force One almost immediately, really kind of as a way to shift political focus as quickly as possible. So Johnson, when he's chosen as Kennedy's vice president in 1963, he is chosen because he is the complete opposite of Kennedy in every way, shape, and form. Whereas Kennedy is youthful and kind of inexperienced politically and a Catholic and a Northerner, Johnson is a Southerner. He is older. He is a very experienced politician. He is also a war hero. He's from Texas. He served in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So really his whole kind of thing was to appeal to the voters that Kennedy couldn't appeal to, right? Johnson is also, he's kind of an intimidating guy. He's sort of, a big guy. He's pretty crass. Like, he's not afraid to, yell at you, swear at you, get right up in your face. It's actually something called the Johnson treatment, where basically he would try to intimidate you to get what he wanted. He was known to skinny dip in the White House swimming pool, for example, pretty interesting guy. But basically, so he becomes president, obviously, as soon as Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. The vice president that he chooses is a guy named Hubert Horatio Humphrey, whose name I literally only mention because I think it might be the worst name ever in political history. But he sort of rides the wave of John Kennedy's popularity and runs for his own term of office in 1964. So he finished the last year of Kennedy's administration, then runs against a guy named Barry Goldwater in 1964 and wins the presidency in one of the greatest landslides in all of American history. So in 1964, one of the most popular men in the country. By 1968, when he could have run for his second term, he gets on television and he makes a speech and says, "I will not seek, nor will I accept my party's nomination." So by 1964, he is so unpopular that he chooses not to run for president, knowing that he couldn't get elected if he did. And this is mostly because of the Vietnam War. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about Vietnam. But basically know that in just 4 short years, he goes from being incredibly popular to being one of the most unpopular men in the country. So Johnson is a domestic president. He really wants to focus most of his attention on domestic policy and sort of trying to fix what's going on in the United States, especially in terms of poverty. So he proposes something that he calls the Great Society. So the Great Society is in many ways very much like the New Deal, except that we weren't in an economic depression. So these programs are really sort of aimed at trying to tackle poverty in our country. So the programs tackle everything from education to healthcare. Medicare and Medicaid are part of this. Consumer issues, so trying to get safety in buying. Like I said, poverty as well. There are job training programs, preschool programs like Smart Start, housing and urban development. So if you've ever heard of people talking about the projects, these are homes that are government funded. That's what HUD does. And actually, if you'll flip to the chart page in your packet, you'll see a list of tons of programs there. And so these programs, on that chart page, there's some things at the bottom for you to write down. But basically, the goal of this was to finish JFK's domestic agenda. Kennedy never really got around to domestic policy. His first presidential term was taken up by, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all of those other things that he really couldn't focus on what he wanted to accomplish within the country. So part of the Great Society was really sort of tackling that agenda, but it went above and beyond JFK's domestic policy. What Johnson said he was doing was declaring what he called an unconditional war on poverty. So basically saying, we are going to do everything we can to eliminate poverty in this country. So if you look at those programs, that's what a lot of them are aimed at doing. He also said that he wanted to help those who, what he called, were on the outskirts of hope, basically people who thought they had nowhere else to turn, right? And the question is, did it work? Billions and billions of dollars were spent on Great Society programs. And by 1969, so by the end of his presidency, 206 programs were passed. And like I said, billions of dollars went to those programs. So did it do what it was supposed to do? Well, if you look at one statistic, yeah, it did. If you look at the percentage of Americans living in poverty in 1963, so when Johnson becomes president, almost 1/5 of the country, 21% of the country, was living in poverty. In 1970, 11% of the country was living in poverty. That's still a really high number, but from 1/5 to 1/10, that's pretty good. He, cut poverty in half. Of course, there is debate about, is it the government's job to spend that much money, that much taxpayer dollars on these kinds of programs? But at least in the short term, it definitely worked. There's, again, a lot of debate on whether the long term worked, but still, again, 21 to 11% is a pretty big jump. So this was the main part of his domestic agenda. Wasn't the only thing, so go ahead and flip back to the other page there. So first of all, he did try to tackle immigration. So immigration had been really limited in the United States pretty much since the 20s. We're now in the 60s, so it's 40 years later. So he opened the door for immigration, kind of got rid of some of the immigration quotas. Asian and Latin American immigration had been pretty heavily restricted, so he opened that up to allow more Asian and Latin American immigrants into our country. He also was a big tackler of civil rights. So after the Birmingham demonstrations in '63, Kennedy really wanted to jump on the civil rights bandwagon. And he is the one who started the civil rights bill pushing through Congress. But he is assassinated before the bill can be passed. So Johnson is actually the one that signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which makes discrimination, segregation illegal in any form in this country. So that's a really big step in civil rights. After civil rights, Martin Luther King goes to the president and he says, okay, Johnson, we got the segregation thing down. Now let's tackle voting. And it is in 1965, after the March on Selma and other civil rights movements, that the Voting Rights Act is passed to make it so that African Americans are able to get to the voting booth, are able to register to vote, and have their voice in this country. So some really big domestic agenda stuff, right? Now, in terms of foreign policy, Johnson's entire foreign policy is Vietnam. We're going to talk more specifically about Vietnam later, but the one thing you need to go ahead and know about Vietnam right now is this is the thing that's going to cause him to lose popularity. It takes money away from the Great Society. It takes focus away from his domestic policies, and really that is going to be the big downfall in his administration is the Vietnam War. Now, in terms of the judicial branch, a couple important things that are passed here. So the Chief Justice at the time is a guy named Earl Warren. He is a pretty liberal judge. He's actually appointed by Eisenhower, who's a Republican, but in many ways he's a very liberal judge. And his kind of effect on the Supreme Court is opening up the laws of America. It's a more liberal Supreme Court. And there's a lot of focus on the rights of the accused. So if you are arrested, protecting your rights as someone who is innocent until proven guilty. So just a couple different laws here, or Supreme Court cases here. You'll go into a lot more detail on these in civics. I just want you to know the basics right now. So there is Baker versus Carr. Baker versus Carr is all about gerrymandering, which is drawing of district lines. And basically the goal is one man, one vote, making sure everybody's voice gets heard. Mapp versus Ohio says that the police cannot do illegal searches and seizures without a warrant. Miranda versus Arizona is the reading of your rights. So when you are arrested, being told what your rights are. Gideon versus Wainwright is access to a lawyer, even if you cannot afford one, so that the state has to provide one for you. And Escobedo versus Illinois confirms the fact that you are allowed to have a lawyer during questioning and that you can request one and that they cannot question you until you have one. So that you can see here a lot of these rights that we take for granted today. I'm sure you've heard of most of these. They weren't guaranteed until the 60s, and we can thank a lot of that to Earl Warren. So I know this was a really quick overview of Johnson, but it should give you a general idea of what he was focused on. The main two things to get from Johnson are the Great Society and Vietnam. So the fact that his focus was supposed to be the Great Society, the domestic programs, but Vietnam took focus away from that. So that's where we are. I'll see you guys in class as we wrap up talking about the rest of the 60s. Have a great one.